Hello, in this video I'm covering the game between Alireza Firouzja and Dimitrios Mastrovasilis from round 6 of European Team Championship. And let's see what happened. The opening was Sicilian. And we had the variation of Taimanov. Knight c6, knight c3 and queen c7. Here Alireza chose bishop e2 and now he goes for a6, a typical setup in Taimanov. And here white took on c6. Here queen c6 would be more passive approach, leading to some hedgehog-like positions. After queen c6, a4 to stop b5, and after b6, bishop e3. It would also be a normal developing game, nothing too drastic. But in the game, black chose to take with the pawn, with the b pawn, bc6, and here white plays queen d3. A beginning of a very peculiar line. If he chose to castle here, black would play d5 and he would have a normal game. Queen d3 and now knight f6 first. And here white chose to play queen g3 to offer the trade of queens. And if black doesn't accept, then black has some trouble to develop because g7 is under attack and the bishop cannot move. Capture on g3. Sergei Karyakin played this with white and his opponent played d5 also, like in the game. But here Alireza takes on d5. There's an interesting variation here, which Karyakin played in the game. He played g4, sacrificing this central pawn. And the point is, if black takes on e4, now you take and go bishop e3. And now black is a pawn up, but he has problem with his structure. And also white has an option of doubling on the h-file once he castles on the long side. For example, if he goes bishop b7, white castles, then c5, and now rook h5. Attacking the c5 pawn. If he tries to defend with rook c8, g5 is good. Fixes this h7 pawn. Next is going to be rook dh1, and he will regain his pawn with a slightly better structure because of these weak pawns on the queen side, and white will be slightly better. Instead, he takes on d5, black takes, and now bishop f4, trying to stop e5 from happening, controlling some central squares. Bishop b4, and now to stop knight e4 because it's a pretty huge threat, he plays bishop e5. And now knight e4 is not possible because of g7 pawn which hangs, so now king e7 first. And white plays g4. With g4 he's trying to execute his plan to fix the h7 pawn which you saw in the previous line. Black plays bishop b7 here and now a3. And now the bishop cannot take on c3 because it would weaken dark squares. The bishop pair would be too strong with g5 coming up next. He just plays bishop d6, offers a trade, and now white captures and goes g5. Now the h7 pawn is in a big trouble. There's a huge threat of white doubling on the h-file and collecting this pawn. Knight goes back, and now he castles. Now the h7 pawn is a real target, so black has to react quickly. So he chose to play h6 immediately, because if he doesn't do it in time, then white is going to double on the h-file and h7 pawn would be eventually lost, or knight would have to go to f8, which is very passive. And now white took, rook h6, and now they exchanged one pair of rooks. g3 to secure his pawns on the king side. f5 now. Black wants to push some pawns in the center, to push f5 and then e5 next. Rook d4, because rook h1 is impossible since d4 is double attacking the knight and the rook. So his only way to attack the h6 pawn is with rook d4. Knight f6, and now first he plays rook b4. The point of this is to get black's king far from the center, because if he goes bishop c6 now, then with rook h4 the rook cannot defend the pawn because the a6 pawn is under attack. And if bishop c8, again after rook h4 you cannot defend the pawn because the bishop is blocking. If you go rook b8, then bishop a6 is decisive. So king has to go back to c7. And now he goes rook h4. Rook h8, defending. And now f3. Probably trying to stop any knight e4 jumps, which would pretty much reduce the material. Now black goes e5, and now knight a4. Trying to reach c5 square. And probably if black tried something like king d6, white would go with b4 and get his knight anyways to the c5 square. a5 was played, because knight c5 was would be attacking the pawn on a6. White goes to c5 anyways, bishop c6, and now f4. Since he cannot really put these pawns into danger, he wants to provoke some weakening moves, like e4 in this case, which would weaken the d4 square. That's what black does, he pushes e4. I think that after king d6 and taking on e5, king takes knight d3, the position would be maybe slightly more pleasant for white, but after king d6, knight f4, now black would have a target in g3 pawn. Instead he went for e4. Black creates a passed pawn, but in return he weakens the d4 square, which would be a very nice outpost for the knight. Knight goes back to b3, king defends it, and now he goes to d4. Now the f5 is under attack, so bishop d7 is played. And now bishop h5. White is trying to get to g6 next, to target f5, so black plays rook g8. But now bishop f7, and black cannot capture on g3 because of rook h6 and hitting on this knight, which would be lost because of the pin. So rook g7 now, and bishop e6. Now the h6 is under attack, but also is f5, and now black has to take on e6. But now white has a nice in-between move. Rook takes h6 first. Bishop goes to d7, because if he takes on g3, then he's losing the bishop after rook f6, and that's game over. So he goes back to d7. He takes, black is a pawn down, but there is always possibility of black's king getting active and pushing this e-pawn. King c5, knight b3, and now he goes king c4. Black's king is very active now. On the contrary, white's king is very passive on c1, and if the rook gets active, then maybe white would get into some trouble. White took on a5, which was an imprecise move. Instead, he should just activate his king, and in case of rook g3, then he would take on a5, and now the e-pawn would not be so dangerous, because after king d4, c3, and now after king c5, then b3. And white is a pawn up, and the e-pawn would not be as dangerous as in the game. And if he tried something like d4, in this case, then rook d6, attacking the pawn and winning it on the next move. White took on a5, and now king goes to d4. Rook d6, and bishop b5 now. It was also possible to go to e3, not being afraid of losing the d5 pawn, because after king f2, the e-pawn would be very, very scary now. Even though black is 3 pawns down, this e-pawn might decide the game on its own. And also g3, if you want, you can take g3 at some point. But instead he played bishop b5, rook b6, and now bishop e8. A very bad move by black. He could have managed a draw after rook h7. And in case of rook takes b5, then just give a check, king d2, and now e3. When he goes to e2, then give a check, and perpetual check would appear. Because after king f1, if you try to escape, now king e4, with a very nice threat of king f3 and checkmating the king. If knight c6, to stop this king f3, then rook h1. And in case of king g2, if you go king e2, then just give checks. And if king g2, then e2. And if white tries rook b8, then rook g1. And again, black has a perpetual check, and it's a draw. But instead, he chose to play bishop e8. And now king d2 was played, getting his king to stop king e3. e3 check, because you cannot capture really on g3 because of knight b3, and if king c4 then rook b4 checkmate. e3 was played, king e1, because king e2 would run into bishop h5, which is unnecessary in this position. If you play this, then bishop h5 would check, and then he takes on g3, which leads to very unnecessary complications. So king e1 to avoid check, king e4, and now rook e6 first. King f3, and now white cannot be greedy and capture because of rook h7 and checkmating threats on h1. First he needs to get his knight to b3, because in case of rook h7 he has a nice check on d4, and then there's no king on f3 anymore. You can even take first on e3, and when he takes you take the bishop, and there's no checkmate, it's all safe. So here bishop g6 was played, and now white gave a check, king g3, took on e3, and after king f4 he went for king f2, now threatens knight e6 with the fork. And what does black do? If he moves his rook to d7 to avoid this fork, now knight e6, and if king g4, rook g3, and the bishop hangs, because if you try to defend it by king h5, knight f4 will lose it. Black decides to go bishop f7 here, but it doesn't help him because white has a check on e2, and if king g5, rook g3 was played. King f6, now they exchange rooks, and after king e3, in this position black resigned, because if he tries to get closer with his king, king blocks the f-pawn, next move is going to be knight d4, let's say bishop e6, knight d4, bishop d7, and now b3, and now white will push his a pawn, then his b pawn, the king is stuck defending the f5 pawn, bishop is also stuck defending the same pawn, and the recipe is next. If the bishop just shuffles on the diagonal, then you just push. And now push the b5, a6, b6, and so on and so on. That's it. Thank you so much for watching, and have a nice day. Goodbye.